My guest tonight is Jay Dyer. He has graciously decided to return to the show to talk about a few things. Jay, how are you doing tonight?
Doing great, Tim.
Yeah, Jay, of course, you're the guest of Jay. No, sorry, you're the host of Jay's Analysis.
Sometimes I'm the host and the guest.
Yeah, yeah. And also, you've got that show, Esoteric Hollywood, on the talknetwork.com, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, I can't stress how good that show is. I've listened to most of the shows,
Oh, have you? Wow. Okay.
and I get the opportunity to listen to those, and that's good, great analysis. There, sometimes it's a monologue. Sometimes you have a guest on the show, right?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
And it just kind of depends on timing and when you can get people and being busy. And so, yeah, a lot of them are just my monologues on different films. But this next week, I should have quite a few guests coming up on next week's shows.
Yeah, yeah. Your last one, or at least the last one I listened to, was your one with Richard Grove. That was interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, Rich, I
Oh,
think
good.
was the second episode, and so it doesn't seem like it, but I'm already almost, I think, just about 20 episodes in this
Okay.
Hollywood. So, yeah, it's funny hearing stuff from like 2 months ago
Yeah.
because I recorded that before the show was even, or the network was even going, I think.
And you have a book coming out next year?
I should be ready in spring. I've got to have the manuscript completely draft done. It was more or less the content's complete, but yeah, it's looking like the spring is when it will be printed and out.
Okay. And of course, it's jaysanalysis.com. That you can pay a nominal fee, monthly fee of $4.95, and get access to his full lectures, interviews, and other productions on that on the show. And it is just totally listener supported, and that's what keeps Jay in
Yep,
business.
absolutely. You
So
can see special bootleg clips of me walking down the runway doing a catwalk and no, none of my modeling. I'm kidding.
yeah,
It's pretty serious philosophical
yeah.
lectures, and for all the people who do subscribe, everybody really likes it. I get 95% positive feedback.
Mm.
So, thank you.
It's good stuff. Good stuff. So tonight, let's talk about. Well, this is about 2 weeks ago now, the Friday the 13th, the Paris attacks. They were allegedly carried out by ISIS, this global terror network that has magical powers to prop up anyone and attack. And
Cobra.
by the way, I really dug that video you sent to me about the Cobra and then the
I
Cobra.
know you say that and people don't believe it. I don't know how many times I've mentioned that video and people are like, "No, it doesn't have Cobra saying the Federal Reserve's bad." I'm like, "Yeah, it does."
that's,
and
that's,
and Cobra doubloons are gold.
I know. That's like, what, they're gold coins. I was like,
Exactly.
oh, so what type of social program is going on there?
Nations of the earth,
Your government's
your
irresponsibility.
governments are irresponsible. Paper money.
But you were on Boilerplate, the it's a weekly a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
No, sorry, Boiler Room. I'm sorry,
Boiler
Boiler Room. And you engaged in sort of an impromptu debate with this journalist from, I guess he's from France, Bernard.
Roman Baguette.
Gee.
Excuse me, Roman Bernard.
Okay. Well, I don't want to be too hard on him because of the language barrier. So I'll be
Well, yeah, you can. That's all on me. That's not you.
okay. But you were talking about, I guess, his perspective of what went on there because he was actually in Paris, I believe. But you
Right.
got into a discussion on what was the true nature of the attacks, and the false flag terrorism came up. And he seemed to think that it was just crazy Muslims and nothing to do with, say, NATO or Inside or Job, or nothing to do with French intelligence. And you engaged in a debate with him. I listened to it, and you went. You guess you kind of challenged him on some of the history of this stuff, false flag terrorism, Anglo-American support for terrorism throughout
Right.
the decades. So let you talk about it. Go ahead.
Well, I think that initially in that debate, what happened was I gave just an opening, like 5 or 7 minutes of my thoughts on the attack. And so, in 5 or 7 minutes, I can't cover all the bases and all the data points that I was aware of. And I don't even claim to have, any kind of inside knowledge on it. But he seemed to take issue with some of the points that I made about the prevalence of inside jobs or staged terror, black ops, and all this kind of stuff. And so it ended up kind of being a debate about the degree to which these things are engineered and staged. And um, from my vantage point, especially in the last few years, focusing on how much coordination can be involved, and I believe is involved in these kinds of operations, big scale events, capstone events, whatever terms you want to use, that tie together mass media, film productions, Hollywood, and then the actual so-called events themselves. And being that I've put so much time and focus into that, I certainly don't want to be myopic and read things according to my own predetermined paradigm. But to my mind, there's just extensive evidence that goes to show that I think my perspective in that debate was correct. And I've read Roman's works in the past. He's I think a well-intentioned guy. I don't have any personal problems with him. But I think that what happens in the far, what you might call the far right, and on a lot of issues, I would probably be in agreement with them. But what you might call the far right tends to shy away from things that are so-called conspiratorial. But as you and I are probably aware, what we call conspiratorial is, again, really dependent on what our paradigm is. And so if we have this paradigm of thinking that, the history of Islam is just completely about jihad against the West, that's not really accurate historically. And so, I've put a lot of time into church history, and, I know about the Crusades. I know about, different periods where you would have exarchs chosen to represent Christianity or Eastern Orthodox Christianity in Jerusalem, chosen by Muslims. And certainly there have been wars, but what I think is the key to understand is to look at it like the model of how the U.S., for example, would use evangelicalism, right? So if Bush wanted to mobilize the majority evangelical and to some degree, I guess, Catholic members of, who would make up the majority of believers in, say, the military, or in order to up the numbers of enrollments and recruitments to the military, after 9/11, you would have the invocation of it's a new crusade against the terrorists that hate our freedoms, right? So you invoke this idea of the crusade.
Remember that general?
Huh?
Remember that general who was talking about that? There's a general who was saying that it's a crusade and Islam is of the devil.
Probably. I mean, yeah, this
makes you think that was staged too, just to get enrollment up.
Probably, yeah.
I'm sorry, that just came to mind when you're talking. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I agree. And but that this invocation of the Crusades, of course, what I'm saying is that more when we think about it like that, we know that Bush and these people and these generals, they're not viewing it in a religious way, right? I mean, they're just pragmatically invoking this imagery and the evangelical base that they have to motivate things for a political motive, or move things for a political motive is what I'm trying to say. And so what I'm saying is that that's how humans operate, and it's, in my mind, it would be no different in the history of Islam. So you might have sultans, you can find old papal letters to the leaders of different Islamic nations from the Middle Ages, and they would be on very good terms. Now, how would that even be possible if, the whole history of Islam was just to completely wipe out people? So what I'm getting at is that you might have a sultan who, for example, would have St. John of Damascus, the famous Orthodox theologian, as his right-hand man. How could you be the sultan's right-hand scholar and consultant if he just wants to lop your head off? So, in other words, we're dealing with human beings who have different motives and different ideas at times. And yeah, sometimes you'll have, the Turkish Empire or the Ottoman Empire or whatever, wanting to expand. But and what's going to happen? Well, they're going to do what Bush and people might do with biblical texts, use them as a way to say, we got to kill the infidels, right? We got to, it's the Muslims that are the infidels, they're of the devil. And then vice versa. The state will always seek to use the doctrines of the church or the religious group, whatever it is, And in Islam, it's a little more combined. You have the notion of, the leader of the religious perspective, the religious arm also being a political figure.
Yeah, yeah.
But that doesn't mean that it's always the same. That's so, I mean, that's what I'm saying is that it's just different. It's different things in different periods and different, different motivations. And there have been periods of peace, between these groups. So, there are Jews that live in Iran, right? There were periods of, the Middle Ages where Jerusalem, had all three faiths living in peace. Now, so, it's just not, it's not, it's very simplistic to say, oh, it's this whole chunk of people against our whole chunk of people, when there are, how many divisions in Christianity are there in terms of sects, right? I mean, there's 30,000 Protestant sects, right? We would not say that, when Pastor Terry Jones burns Korans, that this represents the entirety of Christianity, right? And I'm not at all pro-Islam. My view of Islam is that it's kind of a syncretistic thing that, comes out of Nestorianism, which is a 4th, 5th, 6th century Christian heresy that dealt with the person of Christ. And Nestorius was the Archbishop of Constantinople, and prior to his being condemned as a heretic, Nestorius taught that Christ was a human person. And the traditional Orthodox Catholic doctrine is that Christ is not a human person in any sense. He's a divine person with a human nature. And so this teaching of Nestorius spread in places like Syria, spread in areas like Damascus and so forth. And this is where you get the rise of Islam, where, according to scholars like J.N.D. Kelly, excuse me, not J.N.D. Kelly, Jaroslav Pelikan, you get the notion that Christ is another one of the prophets in a long line of prophets, and then Muhammad being the final prophet. And then, so in other words, you need and for that theology to arise, you need something setting the stage for it. And I tend to agree that it's Nestorian theology that set the stage for that. And I believe Pelikan argues in his series on the history of Christian thought, I believe he argues that it was Nestorian monks that influenced the theology of Muhammad, as well as perhaps Jewish theology. And so you could see how what would develop out of that would be this idea of just a long line of prophets. Anyway, so what I'm saying is that, yes, did Muhammad lead conquest? Well, he led conquests against who were believed to be the outright pagans. And, you do have in the Quran the statements about people of the book and so forth. Anyway, but it's not, the point of this is not a lecture on Islam, but I don't.
But seventh century battles are not relevant.
Exactly. And that's kind of what Roman Bernard was, where he and I were differing, was that I don't think he took into account the major geopolitical alignments of the last couple centuries and how that would play into, the rise of Salafism, Wahhabism, and these entities that were very much a creation of the British Empire, quite openly, from their top scholars and intelligence analysts such as Mark Curtis. Mark Curtis is a fellow of the Royal Society. Yeah. So he has a 600-page book on this called Secret Affairs.
And that is so crucial understanding this.
I know it is. It's very crucial. And, again, this is a guy straight out of the Royal Society. And he says at the beginning of that book that he's going from Royal Society archives. So this is like in the sense of what Carol Quigley did with the CFR archives. This is Mark Curtis looking at the Royal Society archives on the history of intelligence operations back to the late 1800s. And so, you find all these letters between Lord Halifax and these different people to T.E. Lawrence. And then you figure out about Harry St. John Philby, who's the father of Kim Philby. And you see that, he's over there, just like T.E. Lawrence, wearing wearing desert gear and hanging out with Ibn Saud, and then so this is suddenly the chosen dynasty, right? When then these are people that are obviously legates of the empire. It's not it's not that hard to figure out. And the arguments I've been making consistently in the last several interviews is to try to parallel. If you want to understand that, all you got to understand is the same thing that goes on in any kind of radical movement or ideology. And it's the same thing with black markets. It's the same thing with gun running. It's the same thing with drug running. It's the same thing with ideologies like this, or something like, what's that? Westboro Baptist, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
it's like the liberals' wet dream of this, radical Baptist group that flies around the world and protests homosexual.
Is that the God hates fags guy?
Yeah, yeah.
Doesn't he have actual connections to the intelligence?
Yeah, I call him Fed Phelps, right?
Yeah, I mean,
his name's Fred Phelps, but more accurately
Fed
Fed
Phelps.
But yeah, it's so obviously transparent, cheeseball thing. But what I'm saying is that just if you want to understand Wahhabism and the radical jihad, just expand that on a wider scale.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I think we see with the history of Islamic radical terror. And by the way, where was all the radical terror before the Cold War ended?
Well, they figured it would be unfair it's like a martial arts movie where they all come at you separately instead of one time, so you can fight them off. I guess I don't know.
Yeah, everybody's okay. I say right. So the jihadis were being fair, and there were like embassy bombings, in the 70s and things like that. But
that was probably the Mossad. But that's why.
You read Robert Baer's book. What's his book? The something. What the one that's the basis for the Syriana, the George.
Syriana, yeah.
Anyway, you read that book and I'd be careful, I guess, what I want to say. But you read that book and you're like, well, how's he know all this?
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, it's you don't have to go too far in these books where you start piecing this stuff together. And it was about 2012 when I got Curtis's book, because I was working on my thesis, and I was really wanting to learn a lot about British intelligence, and that's just such a massive like hall of mirrors. You could spend your whole life reading about British intelligence, because it goes back to several hundred years. But yeah, now so you just have to understand the geopolitical alignments of the last few hundred years, I think, before you can accurately place the jihad. And I'm open to correction on this, but what I see so consistently in when you analyze these different so-called events, that there's always a provocateur, there's always connections to the intelligence agencies, there's always people have been long under surveillance. I live close to these what are completely fake so-called radical Islamberg and Islamville, which is supposed to be part of the Sheikh Gilani network, and this is supposed to tie into the death of Eric Pearl from the Wall Street Journal or whatever. And that's all baloney. And I don't know about his death, but I'm saying that this is a bunch of terror networks, and then you see all these evangelicals make these documentaries and that promote the idea that Islamberg and Islamville are these terror compounds that are being protected by the radical Islamist Obama.
Yeah.
And this is all complete baloney, because this thing is not far from me. It's right by the military base, by the way. So that's completely preposterous that a radical terror training compound is going to be built right next to this massive Fort Campbell that takes up like a city, a city-sized military base, the 101st Airborne, right? And they're going to have this it was like 5 shacks that makes up this Islamville. And this is a radical terror network. And then you go online and you look up, and there's the FBI literally is having picnics there with them. So
yeah,
it's completely preposterous. And my assumption would be, of course, I've never been to France. I don't live in France. But my assumption would be that this is the same kind of thing that goes on, is that you have this. By the way, another point that I think I tried to make to Roman was the obvious falsity of the ISIS videos. All of this slew of ISIS videos in the last year and a half, 2 years, are quite obviously staged. The mainstream media has even admitted that they're fake, they're hoaxed. They exhibit all the signs of being completely manufactured. I don't know where they're manufactured, but when I see Turkish soap operas that display the exact same situation as the ISIS videos. That would suggest to me maybe these are filmed in Turkey, maybe they're filmed in Saudi Arabia, maybe they're filmed in Germany somewhere. I don't know, but different people have suggested different possibilities on where these videos originate from. But of course, they always come to the media through Site Intelligence Network, which is obviously a CIA, Mossad connected entity. It's pretty obvious. It's not hard to figure that one out. Now, that's even in mainstream media, where that entity comes from. So that's not a conspiracy theory. We know why. I don't know why these far right groups. They just. I think that what they'll say generally is that they want to keep up appearances. Well, I don't hate to break it to you, but nobody cares about like you're already pegged as crazy. So I don't know why. You know what I'm saying? Like I don't know why you'd be worried about what people think. Well, if we talk about conspiracies, then the people think we're crazy. But I've heard there's people on the far right say this, and I'm just thinking, well, you're already pegged as crazy.
You're already being called Nazis.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, anyone who doesn't completely go along with total Maoism is going to be called a Nazi by this lying establishment. But I'm rambling. But I mean, books like Tragedy and Hope, that's why they're so important, is because they give us a framework from which to place a lot of these so-called independent actors in geopolitical theater. And the more that you dig into these kinds of things, and a lot of the excellent talks that you've done with people relating to the mafia and these kinds of things, is that you start to see that, it's not really that many independent actors out there, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what I think is crucial to see. And that might be a bit daunting, but the reality is what it is, daunting or not. But Tragedy and Hope is great for that.
Yeah, because it gives you an idea of just how fixed it all is, and also how it's fixed, how it got to be that way,
how it was there, and that's the other thing, is that you can't have, in the way our system is structured, all of this liquid cash moving around, which would be required for things like terror networks, nuke networks, arms. Right? You can't have all of this.
They're selling refined oil, or
yeah, right.
And everyone knows there's Erdogan's son, who's using his shipping company to ship the oil out, and the trucks are going out. It's
Yeah. Now, when you start thinking about that, then you start thinking, oh, wait a minute. And so, I wonder if this has been going on for a long time. These big families have been running these kinds of things for a long time, and that's exactly what you see about the Astors and the Onassis, and I'm not just picking them out. I'm just using them as examples of that's how this kind of stuff works, that they were running drugs probably for the shipping networks, right?
Certain industries are ripe for it. Whether it's,
exactly.
I mean, even like bottling companies, like what? Pepsi company refining heroin, and using one of their factories in Vietnam to refine heroin, opium and the heroin.
And I've not seen Breaking Bad, but everybody tells me that it kind of shows all this too. Like all this stuff's done kind of under the purview of the establishment.
Yeah, it tells you how a drug dealer will open up a drug importer. A narcotics trafficker will buy a chain of restaurants and use that to funnel the money through, and the money goes to a multinational corporation based in Germany, which pushes the stock up. And they just look.
That sounds like Catherine Austin Fitz.
It's Catherine Austin Fitz model. And when I was watching Breaking Bad, I was reading her article. I was like, "Whoa, this is it! This is it! Look at this!"
Wow.
Of course, they never mentioned, of course, the corruption, the DEA, and they stopped.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, but it is interesting how wow, look at that. That's how it's being played out.
Well,
so
there's a great quote I want to read here from Tragedy and Hope. This is page 364. I have in the newer edition, and it reads.
Yeah, I like how you were talking to Richard Grove. You both knew the page number of the quote.
Yeah. Now
it's like 1,200-page book.
We had a great talk on that, and now I've mentioned this one in this point in a bunch of interviews, but I've never read the quote, so I want to read the quote. And he says, the basic key to the new emphasis on autarky is to be found in the fact that the advocates of such economic behavior and new competition of the meaning of had a new conception of the meaning of sovereignty. For them, sovereignty had not only legal and political connotations it always held, but in addition had to include economic independence. Since the economic independence could, according to the theory, be obtained only by the great powers, the lesser states were to be deprived of sovereignty in its fullest sense and had to be reduced to a kind of vassal or client condition in respect to the great powers. The theory was that the great powers, each great power, in order to enjoy full sovereignty, must adopt a policy of autarky. Since no power, however great, could be self-sufficient within its own national boundaries, it must extend the sphere of autarky to include its weaker neighbors, and this sphere would have political as well as economic implications, since it was unthinkable that any great power could permit its lesser neighbors to endanger it by suddenly cutting off supplies or markets. The theory thus led to the conception of continental blocks consisting of aggregates of lesser states about the few great powers. This theory was entirely in accord with the political development of the late 19th century and early 20th. This development had seen an increasing disparity in the new powers of the states with a decreasing number of great powers. So here we have this centralization. The decline of the number of great powers occurred because of the advances of technology, which had progressed to a point where only a few states could follow. The theory of continental blocks was also in accord with the growth of communications, transportation, weapons, administration, etc. Now he goes on from there to talk about the continental bloc was a plan that was had by both Allied and Axis powers. So in other words, both sides foresaw this, and I read about the first half of Joseph P. Farrell's new book, The Third Way, which is about the Axis view of this. And so what we see is that it's not just the Anglo-American establishment, it's also the other so-called enemies of the West that had the exact same plan, mm-hmm. which is continental blocks in a new world order. So what I'm saying is that you can't approach 20th century politics without understanding the centralization of nation states and sovereignty into the great powers, and the great powers themselves are run by the banks, which is what Quigley says consistently throughout this big book, right?
Yeah, this is when Rothschild sent his sons to the Five Nations, and to establish banks and to loan the government's money.
Yeah,
that plan, and
that's why it's not possible in our setup to have independent actors, at least on a large scale.
Yeah,
I mean, you might have independent actors on a small scale for sure, but when you reach a certain level, there's not going to be independent actors because you need to use the fiat money. You're forced to, mm-hmm. and you're forced to wire transfer it somewhere. You're forced to do all these things, which are you got to stash liquid cash somewhere. Like you're forced to do all these things that the system is going to know about. Is what I'm trying to say. It's not going to be able to be done secretly because the continental bloc model was already in place in the late 19th and into the 20th century. Now you might have people at the tops of these different groups, vying for power with one another at times. But as you notice, the same plan seems to march forward.
Mm-hmm. And, of course, that's why you have countries like Syria or Iran being targeted.
Absolutely.
Because they're outside this system.
And even if they have leaders, that are pretending to be opponents of the West, like Ayatollah Khomeini or something like that, you have to keep in mind that it's not the leader that is the problem. It's or the source of the attack. The attack is on the people and their land. Mm-hmm. That's what it's all about. It's not about we got to get Putin, we got to get the Ayatollah Khomeini because he just talking bad about Ronald Reagan. My hero's a saint, Ronald Reagan. Well, that was all a bunch of baloney, and he was, the CIA was there, MI6 too, big time, helping out Khomeini.
Yeah,
and I heard the BBC gave him all this airtime and helped him come to power.
Yeah, I heard talk about Iran, and he was talking. I forget who it was. He was saying the Savak, how it
was all the same secret security.
The Shah did not control the Savak.
Yeah, it was all the same guys that just changed one letter.
Yeah, but
Savama to Savak or something.
Yeah, but the Shah didn't really control Savak. Savak was controlled by Western intelligence.
Exactly.
And there are some people who think that they intentionally aggravated the situation there to bring in Khomeini.
And this is what British intelligence writers say. Yeah.
Yeah, and that, of course, why to do that? Well, pump up the price of oil, create a crisis. Pick your Chase Manhattan Bank wanting to seize the Shah's assets. There's all types of motives you can come up with.
A lot of motives, and the intelligence in Iran was all a bunch of people at Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is BP, which is all the MI6 people.
MI6, yeah. And I did make I said that in one interview where I was somewhat skeptical about that. So we don't know about that, but at the end of the day, the Iranian hostage crisis did put Chase Manhattan Bank in the black again.
Well, there's Stephen Dorrell's book, The Way, and I think I've mentioned it to you before, I can't recall, but he says it to the effect of, MI6 was there all along, and what they would do is look for the coming trends. And so if the Shah was looking to lose favor, then what they wanted to do was be ahead of the trend. And so they wanted to make sure that they had the mullah or the ayatollah who was going to come to power to be their man. And that's how it works. So it's about, looking ahead to, looks like we're going to eventually get a revolution here. People aren't liking this Shah guy. We got to get ready for, the next guy.
Yeah. And of course, the question is, where did the Ayatollah get his organization funding?
Exactly.
Step in. It's like ISIS today, where you brought up. Where are they getting this funding? Of course, the story is, they're smuggling oil out.
Yeah, and it's in Dreyfus's book, he cites a naval guy from the U.S. who's one of the sources for all this stuff with the Ayatollah, and that this is how it ties into Iran-Contra, that they were meeting with the Ayatollah secretly and all this stuff. So anyway, but I think it's just very insightful from Tragedy and Hope to remember that the overall plan, the Royal Society type plan, is continental trading blocks and free trade because Marx supported free trade in this sense, this is state funded, state mandated free trade, right? Yeah. Where it's only certain companies that'll be able to actually participate in this free trade because of their size and capital.
Yeah.
Where they'll be able to corner the markets, and then of course mom and pop won't be part of this free trade, and you'll have tariffs put on you, I'm sure, if you're mom and pop. But what Quigley is saying here is my point is that the model of the continental trading blocks, it didn't really matter whether it was going to be the Allies or the Axis, because it was the same bankers in the background that are going to make sure that the trading blocks come out according to their plan. And it was really the Depression that would prepare the way for the free trade to come. That was, well, at least what they wanted.
Yeah. It puts a whole new light on, of course, both world wars of the past century.
And Quigley explicitly says that it was banker organized wars.
And I mean, you can just see that with particularly the United States, when the United States is drawn in to bail out J.P. Morgan Bank.
Yes, and it was the New Freedom Initiative, right? And that's what, as I understand at least, took the U.S. out of this older policy of nation building and all this stuff. I mean, there was obviously there was corruption prior to that, but the official outward doctrine, at least, obviously changed with Wilson and Colonel House and all those machinations. But real quick, one more quote here, which is great from Quigley, page 357. The historical importance of the banker-engendered deflationary crisis of 27 to 1940 cannot be overestimated. It gave a blow to so-called democracy and the parliamentary system. And World War II and the post-war were unable to repair fully. It gave an impetus to aggression by those nations where parliamentary government collapsed, and thus became the chief cause of World War II. It so hampered the powers which remained democratic by its orthodox economic theories that were unable to rearm for defense. And he says, it gave rise to a conflict between the theorists of orthodox and unorthodox financial methods, which led to a sharp reduction in the power of the bankers. And finally, it impelled the whole economic development of the West along the road of finance capitalism towards monopoly capitalism, and thereafter towards the pluralist economy. And so here's Quigley telling you that the banker engendered deflationary crisis is what caused. Well, this he says that this is what became one of the chief causes for World War II.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, you have the collapse of the Credit Anstalt Bank, I think, in Austria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Germany. Yeah, there's a whole. He has chapters on that too, right?
Which was like orchestrated out of the Bank of England, if I recall. And that was
then
done,
out of the ashes, you get the BIS, right?
Yeah, the Bank of England was settlements. That's where you get this global concentration, and of course the attempts to reign in Germany and also Japan would fall under that model too, where Japan wanted its day in the sun, and Germany wanted its day in the sun, along with the British Empire. But that would have been an independent player, and that couldn't be tolerated.
And it's important to understand that the leftist movements, as he says, they were all part of the funding for all the leftism and the communism, especially in the West and the U.S., came from all these big bankers. I know you know that, but this is something
most don't.
People still can't seem to get that through their head that national and organization of women. This is something David Rockefeller loves.
Yeah,
communism, Marxism in the U.S., socialism. So any of these kinds of things, David Rockefeller loves these.
Yeah, these are the goons, the dupes that go out and protest and destabilize society, and it creates a dialectic. But that's we get back to the your friend Bernard, his failure to address false flag terrorism. He works for the National Policy Institute,
as I understand.
Okay, and I guess they're primarily concerned with defense of European culture. Here, both in Europe, the United States, and around the world, which mean they're concerned with some of these immigration issues and the culture issues that creates. And so I think what happens is that an incident like this, it's an opportunity for them to advance their agenda. Look, I told you so.
Correct.
And which means they're missing out, or whether unintentionally or intentionally, they're not addressing an important dimension to these attacks, meaning that they're being orchestrated either by a false flag act or organization, which is in reality, by all evidence, is a proxy force of NATO, of DGSC, of the Mossad, and Turkey, which is a NATO country.
Yes.
So in effect,
that's what I'm saying. If we want to solve the problem, it'd be like I'm going to go after the mafia, and I'm going to go for Joey down at the restaurant because he's a hitman for the mafia. Then you take out Joey, but you're forgetting the Don.
Yeah. And here ISIS. It's supported by NATO, the Gulf states, and Turkey. It's based out of Turkey.
I know.
Erdogan, like I mentioned before, Erdogan's son is in charge of shipping oil out of Iraq and Syria into the international markets. And so they're making money off that.
Turkey is a NATO country, and I asked Roman that. I mean, it would not be hard to stop ISIS if they wanted to stop ISIS. It's preposterous.
And of course, you have that. It was the DA report that was dated 2012, 2013 that said that the formation of ISIS was anticipated.
Those documents that were
And so, obviously this, and if you look at it, then the response is we have to go attack Syria, but the Syrian government, the Assad regime is fighting ISIS.
That's how ridiculous the mainstream media in the West can be. Is that it's no different than Iraq, where it was like we had this attack 9/11, so let's go for Iraq and Afghanistan, which had absolutely nothing to do with the so-called Osama bin Laden character.
And Chris, you mentioned that the history of Anglo-American support for these outfits, Radical Islam, the British, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is 1928 about,
right? Which ties into Masonic lodges throughout all the Middle East.
Yeah.
And the Muslim Brotherhood was formed by several characters, very amenable, and several of them pretty much assets of British intelligence. Yeah. Al-Dudi, Al-Banna, exactly.
And this was primarily at the time was to check pan-Arab nationalism or Nasserism, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So this was, but ironically though, that was, according to Miles Copeland and people like that, that was an older CIA strategy where they did want to for a while promote Arab nationalism, and so
Mhm.
you would have the Ba'athist Party being aided by
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
CIA initially, and then for whatever reason, the transition flips over to the British model of utilizing radical Islam. And so if you read Gould and Fitzgerald's book, they argue that it wasn't just 1979, but that the CIA was already there in different universities in Afghanistan prior to that, uh, preparing the way for what would happen in
Hmm.
1979 with the Mujahideen and so forth. So these things are planned. What I'm getting at is that they're planned decades ahead of what we see in the mainstream media of 1979's when Brzezinski and Hamid Gul and Robert Gates got the idea to train the Mujahideen. So this was already in the works for a few decades prior to that. So what you get the impression that and I don't, somebody more educated than me could probably elucidate exactly what point the change went from persons who had the ideas of supporting Arab nationalism to what is Robert Dreyfus called the Ark of Islam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some people have traced it back to that conference on terrorism in 1979, and
Yeah, I think Goldman Fitzgerald mentioned
yeah,
that. Yeah.
and there was like the Safari Club and the
Hmm. Yeah,
neoconservatives and the Bushes and all that stuff. Yeah.
yeah. Joseph Trento's book "Prelude to Terror" is
Mm.
good, where he has a chapter on the Safari Club and how they wanted to move away from Israel and Mossad and more so towards the Saudis, which I'm not sure I really buy that that's exactly what happened. But uh, there are people who are going to be, I guess, fighting over the scraps
Yeah.
of where the U.S. money is going to be appropriated, right?
And also, I think after 1967, you have the growth of Jewish influence, of Israeli influence in U.S. foreign policy, and that's
But it does seem like
yeah.
Trento argues that the Safari Club was more interested in utilizing um, the Sauds
Yeah.
than the Mossad and Israelis, because that really is the older British model.
Hmm.
And then of course, uh, well, I don't know. I always go back and forth on exactly how much I put into the Israeli-Palestinian issue, because I think that there's a lot of baloney on both sides of that, actually.
Well, it serves a lot of interest, doesn't it?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. That's the way to put it.
Keep it festering.
Right.
Um, but the takeaway here again is that we're not the the source of the problem isn't Islam, like fundamentalism. It's a tool, it's a proxy force being utilized
Islamic
by
fundamentalism is a
yeah,
tool or a
yeah,
technology for motivating groups of people, just like radical Westboro Baptist stuff might be done, except that radical Islam is a lot more, I guess you could say, easily. Well, then again, I don't know. You can motivate quite a few people in the Bible Belt with
yes,
with
yeah,
John Hagee, right?
yeah. John Hagee.
This is my book, In Defense of Israel. In this book, you'll see how 24 blood moons show that I can eat 24 moon pies in one. The cake,
Oh,
the anti-cake. I'm going to devour the anti-cake tonight.
of course, he's raking in millions doing that, so
Oh yeah.
that's his interest. Beats an honest living. But yeah, I mean, you have the CIA. I was reading an article by Sybil Edmonds talking about this Fethullah Gulen network,
Mm-hmm.
and CIA support. He was a Turkish cleric who came to the United States penniless, and now runs a network that's worth hundreds of billions of dollars. He runs a string of worldwide network of madrasas throughout the world, and of course he's linked to the CIA. And basically, these madrasas have served as hideouts or operation points for CIA in Central Asia. This is another point of instability or destabilization of the CIA
Yes.
in Central Asia. So there's another example of this, using these Islamic networks to serve, the Anglo-American interest.
Oh yeah, I've
And,
forgotten all the stuff in
yeah,
Central Asia stuff.
he's based out of Pennsylvania or something. Right?
Mhm.
Then you have Graham Fuller and the Caucasus and the Chechnya, and of course how
I,
he was tied to the Tsarinav brothers. and
I even saw Mark sent me an article. I was I'm surprised and not surprised, but Bob Baer has an article where he's like, yeah, everything that we did in the Balkans was completely baloney.
back in the '90s,
Yeah.
and that was done. I mean, I think that was done just to create Camp Bondesteel, which is now a big, uh, uh, you know, shipping point for drugs and human trafficking into Western Europe. By the way, NATO. At least that's what I've read. And
Yes.
and of course the Muslim groups that were like the KLA. These were the shock troops that we were supporting at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I know he's this, so-called, here it is. Yeah. This is EBRITSC.com, British Serb magazine, ebritic.com, and it's CIA exposed by former, yeah, it's just, he's like, yeah, this is, here it is. CIA gave us millions to dismember Yugoslavia. So that was the
Mm-hmm.
whole operation there.
And that's an example of a state that maybe wasn't totally within the system, was independent, or at least
Well,
partially.
it was one of those Soviet satellites that
Yeah.
had restructured just like they did in the 90s with Russia itself. Yeah.
And didn't Madeleine Albright and who was that general again? Head of NATO, former head of NATO,
Wesley Clark.
Wesley Clark. Didn't they make a mint off like communication contracts or something, and getting in there and so-called privatized industries?
I wouldn't be surprised.
I think she did.
That's new to me, but yeah.
Yeah, but
But that's what happens with it was Alan Watt made this great point that I never thought about this the other day, but he was talking about how it's not just like, uh, say, FDR New Deal, and then you have versus all the monopolist privatists or something. He was making the point that you can actually go through phases intentionally, because what happens is wealth is created over time through people's labor and energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what you can do is you can have a period where everybody works, and then you say, you're all being ripped off. Let's nationalize and collectivize everything. So then everything goes into a big pile.
Yeah.
And then you have the phase of privatization, which takes it all. And then after that, after people work for the next couple of decades, you say, oops, everything's privatized and they're all a bunch of crooks and we need to nationalize everything, right?
Is that the history of the Soviet Union?
I guess you get but so I started thinking about that. I was like, oh yeah, so it's not New Deal versus the big bankers. It's a New Deal for a period. It's a business phase, right?
Yeah.
Then the next business phase, right?
And so he really wasn't a traitor to his class. So
Right.
Yeah. If you look at the 75 years in terms of these bloodlines, that's nothing. That's a
Bingo. Yeah.
that's a business thing. Yeah. And they're not out of anything. They're still living on their mansions. They're biding their time.
With it and hidden wealth, and who knows what's
yeah.
if we just find out about the black budget being from Wired magazine, $50 billion that's supposed to be for NASA, which builds these dinky little chemical based robots. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Where's all this black budget money go? It goes to all this kind of stuff, and then there's double books and the CAFRs and all that. So there's who knows what we don't know about. Is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. So.
And if you can print the money, I guess you can do whatever you want anyway.
Yeah, it's just it's a toy. It's a tool you use, but it means nothing to you because you control the resources, which is what the Green Movement, Agenda 21, is all about.
Oh, totally.
It's monopolizing, and it's even the early conservation movement was about that. That's Murray Rothbard did great work on that, about the interest behind the
well, who started the World Wildlife Fund?
Prince Bernard or something.
Exactly right.
Let's control Africa. Let's save animals. That's what it's all about, right?
Yeah, and by the way, I've mentioned it to Richard, but I have Cecil Rose, Flawed Colossus here, and that whole book discusses him being a front man for the Rothschilds, and he was their man sent to Africa.
Yeah.
So exactly what you're saying with the sons going out to loan the five sons in Europe. It was kind of the same type of thing. You send your man out as the banking man. He's your agent. And so when you think about these things like the CIA or whatever, well, these are actually like Rockefeller. That's Rockefeller intelligence.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's their network, right? It's not, the Rockefellers are members of the CIA. Oh, the CIA got the Rockefeller. No, Other way around.
Yeah, it's the business just that formed the Central Intelligence Agency.
Yeah.
And if you didn't know anything about the history of those agencies, they grow right out of, Yale, Skull and Bones, Wall Street,
Right, and
all those,
Pinkerton Security,
yeah.
first so-called first private security, Rockefeller Security. Yeah.
Well, even in the United States, what you have, was it August Belmont, who was a Rothschild's agent,
Mm-hmm.
and he's the one that started the Manifest Destiny meme, and
Yeah.
and God knows what was going on in the South, with exploiting those fissures, right? With the Knights of the Round, what was that? The Knights of the
Golden Circle.
Golden Circle, and that's Masonic, all right, all over it. So,
Yeah, and British intelligence has always been involved in a lot of that stuff too for a long time,
mhm.
because they were very much involved in the South, supporting the South because of cotton and all that.
Yeah, Cotton and the ability to want to divide the United States and all that
Exactly.
stuff. So, all that intrigue, but you get in what's going on in Europe and why a group maybe like Bernard and the National Policy Institute would focus on the say the immigration issue, the cultural issues, which are legitimate issues, by the way.
Sure.
They usually are, and the what you have going on in Europe right now is very similar. It looks like a modern adaptation of what it's called the Caligari Plan. You familiar with that?
Yes, I've yeah.
And the ability, to fundamentally change the face of Europe just by overwhelming it with immigration. Now, I don't know if we've met those proportions yet, but with the combination of that and also the fact that the Europeans have apparently forgotten how to procreate, creates this demographic problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and then they'll even say, what was it, Soros? Or they even said, well, you have a low birth rate, so we're just helping you out.
Yeah, this is after years of bombarding them with psychological warfare, with
Just
sexual,
psyops, yeah.
sexual liberation and birth control.
Right.
So this plan goes back decades, if not centuries. So.
Well, the theme here too is that every time there's a problem, it'll be a legitimate problem.
Mm-hmm.
So environmental issues. Okay, well, that's a legitimate problem at times.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the system's already aware of a problem. They're already ready to give you a prepackaged answer that's their answer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the green movement is. And that's what the immigration false dialectic is.
Yes.
It's always a false solution to a real problem that was foreseen a long time ago. And that's really what happens, I think, with the people on the left in general, is that you grow up and you're in high school, you're kind of rebellious, and so I think a lot of people who get into liberalism or liberal so-called causes, they're corralled into a pen that's already waiting for you,
mm-hmm.
and you think, oh, I'm a Democrat now because we're for the people, and that's all completely manufactured. And then even if people who study themselves or learn themselves out of those things, or those initial dialectical boxes, you can have a trialectic, you can have a quadro, you can go into a movement, of some far right movement or something like that as a reactionary response, and you just have to ask the question, well, where do they get their money? Where does this group get the money?
Mm-hmm.
And so Front National, I don't agree with all of Tarpley's analysis and conclusions and solutions, but he's made the argument that Front National is BFF with NATO, and so just because Le Pen says that she wants to get out of NATO or something, that doesn't mean much. This is like political rhetoric and talking points and trying to score points with who you need to score points with, and it may be. I mean, Le Pen Senior, he's said some good things. He talked about Charlie Hebdo being a false flag, which I thought was pretty cool. But that's just seen as too fringe, too radical, and so all these people they're all worried about perception. But
migration has historically been used as a weapon. There's a book called Weapons of Mass Migration by Kelly Greenhill. Have you heard about her?
Is she the Oxford woman?
Yeah.
Yes, I have, yeah.
But she works for all the usual suspects, from what I understand.
Sure.
And from what I understand, I haven't read the book. I've heard it referenced, and apparently it talks it as a kind of a positive thing, a policy tool. And, forced displacement, coercion as a foreign policy. That's what it's about.
Yeah, it's a pretty devious trick too, right?
I know, because you're disrupting
move all these poor people over to some other place, and
Yeah,
then you're oh, what do you oh you don't have any heart
yeah,
for these poor people. And meanwhile, NATO's bombing Syria.
yeah. And she points out like this occurred in Vietnam when I think she mentions Vietnam. I'm assuming she's talking about the transportation of over a million con- uh, Tonkinese south to destabilize the South, and that created the Viet Cong problem.
Oh wow.
That's at least how
Okay.
Fletcher Prouty describes it.
Right. Okay. I got you.
And lo and behold, you had a problem in the South, and then that justified escalation of the war. Apparently, in North Korea, there are some the West uh, helped create pressure on Chinese border to help China, I guess, control North Korea. But I know your opinion on the North Korea thing. It might just all be staged anyway.
Well, I think what happens is that, like we were saying with MI6 in Iran, is that you get the top people. You get the Kim Jong and Kim Il, and you send them to the CIA boarding schools.
That's right, 'cause he went to all those schools.
Yeah, and then him and the top generals are your man, and they
Yeah.
work with the Western establishment to create the facade of all this baloney of being the boogeyman with these fake videos of people crying, and that there's 200,000 people in death camps that are languishing and having to eat flies for dinner every night, and all this baloney. And then NPR sends people over there to investigate, and they're like, "Oh yeah, it's not that bad. Actually, there's a theme park, and I had a lot of fun."
Yeah.
Now, I mean, could there be? I'm sure there could be death camps too, but I just don't know. Is what
Yeah.
I'm saying. Is I don't know how much that's staged. And a lot of times that's the Daily Mirror, which is complete laughable. They run some of the most ridiculous propaganda. It's like the Daily Mirror is going to be the source for where there's 200,000 people in death
Yeah.
camps.
But this type of demographic warfare of making war with mass migration, that's something that's been done throughout history. Even here in the United States, I've done a number of interviews with Michael Jones. He wrote a book about the destruction of the urban neighborhoods.
Yes, I heard that interview. It was really interesting.
And it's all about social engineering. This involved the construction of the interstate highway system and all about military planning, the concerns of the WASP elite regarding their growing Catholic population, its effect on politics, and also the Jewish elite and their concerns with Catholic power and the Hollywood and all that. So it can
The
be
WASP elite and the Jewish elite. That kind
Yeah.
of sounds like England, doesn't it? Like
Yeah,
with Cromwell and the Jews, right?
another interview he talked about the Puritans, and he said, "Well, the Puritans were Jews."
And it reminds me of that scene in Good Shepherd where Robert De Niro's sitting there and he's talking about helping to set up the CIA or the OSS at the beginning, and he's talking to Matt Damon, and he's like, well, we had the Jews and the WASP, so that they wanted to have at least one Catholic guy on here.
Yeah, that's right. But the whole creation of suburbia was there to change because you could no longer you have these ethnic neighborhoods. You have these bland suburbia where everyone just identifies as middle class, not as a Catholic, not as a Pole, not as an Irish Catholic or Italian, all that. So there's a social engineering operation going on there.
Well, you don't think about all this stuff being that detailed and engineered, but if you think about America as just a big, kind of a big Disneyland,
Yeah.
it starts to make sense because when you go to Disneyland, you're like, oh, everything's a little. It's a small world after. You have like one section that's Aztec temple, and then it's right next to. It's all fake, but it's all engineered to be this. You just think about America being a bigger version of that, and then you can see how there actually is going to be local level strategies that are going to try to demographically change things for whoever's reason. And that's a good example. That would be gentrification.
Yeah. And is it true? I mean, I remember I didn't know about it at the time, but after the Gulf War, General Shortstop came and they had a parade in Disneyland for the victory parade.
I have seen that in books. Tex Mars has book. I remember him talking about that like 10 years ago. It was just so preposterous. But no, I would say if I had to bet, I bet that's 90%. I could believe that. Yeah.
And that's coupled with the fact that CNN was caught faking missile attacks during the Gulf War. So
Oh no.
so, so
And that guy is a broadcaster in St. Louis now.
yeah,
Charles Jaco. It's like he's like a famous local.
yeah,
Somebody needs to go ask Charles Jaco about that.
man. But again, we go back to this. Their concern again. I was talking again. I was talking to E. Michael Jones about that. And I was talking about we got into some of these immigration issues, and I was talking about concerned about the growth of the right and so-called, I guess, whether it's Christian identity or white identity, the white nationalist movement in response to this,
Mm-hmm.
and how they address some real issues and some legitimate issues, but in a way they're being tracked, they're being kind of corralled, being pulled in this dialectic trap. And he made a point. He says the big mistake people make in this is that that they attack their immediate enemy, and they don't deal with who's pulling the strings.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what happened in the 40s and 50s when they brought in the 40s when this huge migration south of these former sharecroppers into the cities, and they intentionally didn't provide them ample housing, and they crowded these neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
The natural reaction is to attack the poor black family, and not to mention the fact when you bring in a bunch of young men from the south into the city, you're going to have all types of crime, rapes, and murders, and all types of problems.
Oh yeah, well, us country boys are crazy.
Yeah, but I'm saying there's not. It's a new. I mean, it's a new environment. You have,
I know. I was kidding.
Young
But
men,
yeah,
young unemployed men. What is
yeah, it's forcing people into these situations to when you can even find Royal Society older Royal Society plans about this kind of stuff, and go back to H.G. Wells and people like that talking about how they would reorganize everyone into the megalopolis, right? Yeah.
And so these troubles were anticipated and desired because they wanted.
Yeah, you need the destabilization on a neighborhood level, right? I mean
and that's one thing that maybe groups like the National Policy Front or Bernard aren't getting. What's occurring in Europe is you want these dust ups and these they want the problems,
Yes, it's unfortunately still part of the left-right dialectic is the problem, and it's not understanding that exactly what you said, that terror functions for the establishment, even in situations where it would seem that the establishment would not want Islamic terror. That can still work for the establishment because it's not just that they want to. The right will always say, "Oh, the left wants to portray Islam as a religion of peace." It's not true. Look at all this tension. But what I'm saying is that it's exactly like what you're saying with the movement of Southerners into urban areas or something like that. There's naturally going to be a reaction, like all these rapes that are happening with Islamic people guys being repositioned into Europe, and yes, the leftist government bureaucrats and dupes will bat a blind eye to all that and let it go, but that doesn't mean that the existing order doesn't like the dust ups. They do.
Yes.
You need the dust ups, and I thought it was a brilliant analysis that Patrick had. A great example of this.
Is Patrick Henningsen?
I'm sorry, yeah, Patrick Henningsen at 21stcenturywire.com we were talking about a year ago about the Abu Ghraib leaks and all that, and the photos, and so I was talking to him. I said, why would the establishment want because I'm skeptical of how because if it's running on NBC and ABC and they're putting out all those Abu Ghraib and raping with battery acid, right? I mean, if it's on there, then it's on there for a reason. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, yeah, I can tell you why they wanted that on there, and that's because it inflames people in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh yeah, obviously. What do the American soldiers do? Oh, well, they play like satanic metal and they rape you with battery acid, and yeah.
Yeah, they want the problem. The action is in the reaction, as they say.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we've seen it play out, I think, in the United States more recently with Baltimore and Ferguson, with some of these instances. Either they're exploited or they're completely fabricated, but either way, they're created to inflame tensions. We've just had a recent thing. I was in all this madness on Black Friday shopping, and you have the every year the media shows the crazy crowd storming the Walmart and trampling people to get the DVD player,
Yeah,
or
right.
and so they have to show that. Okay, my question, and I've never really thought about that. Is it just the state of American culture today, society, or are these things being put out there to get the reaction? And there was one recent incident, where there's a typical someone's filming on their phone, flip phone, and the crowd comes in and they all storm a stacks of boxes. And there's a scene where a white lady steals a box from a little black girl and her mother and runs away. Okay, and that's the scene. So you're thinking this is just the madness of the crowds, but some people have analyzed this one film and they found out that the person, they've analyzed the film. The person came around the corner, had the box, never got to the stacks of boxes where the things supposedly were, and took them and ran.
Mhm.
And not only that, the box itself was a vegetable steamer. That was the item. The vegetable steamers. But the whole point is that we got to the point where now that these things might very well be being staged, right?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised, but
Just to get the reaction.
whether those are not, it fits into the same kind of thing with all this police stuff.
Yeah.
And so the police killing of all the blacks is a great example of what I would say to Roman Bernard, because what happens is that you see that people then are polarized into, well, you're either for these cops or you hate cops, right?
Yep.
And if you're for the cops, well, you're just a racist who you hate cops because of you. When in many of these cases, at least according to the stories, is black and white cops beating the crap out of people, right?
It's both. It's both. Yeah.
Right.
I've tried to make that distinction because people have the immediate reaction. Well, it's these, we aren't black youths. They don't know how to behave. They're a bunch of criminals. And no, it's the cops. They're all thugs and all that. Actually, it's both.
Isn't it both? Yeah, that's what happens in all these kinds of cases.
Yeah. And, it's both. And it's.
And if you want to talk about drugs and gangs and thugs involved in gangs, well, guess what happens in most cities? I have a friend who is involved in neighborhood watch guy in St. Louis, and he was telling me all the lowdown on how certain gangs are involved in the system. And so in other words, there's corruption on the local level with police and the gangs there. And so how many people, I don't know about everybody else, but in my hometown and small towns, it's just known that like certain people are allowed to have the crack house.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so what does that tell you? Well, that tells you that, that there's a level of false dialectic at the local level as well, too. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, to just blindly fall into prepackaged baloney about you're either for the cops or you're racist. Excuse me, you're either racist and with the cops or you're for the people. It's and I watch in my feed too all of these different groups, whether they're leftist revolutionary groups, Occupy type groups, Revolution Media, all these different big outlets that have hundreds of thousands of followers, millions of followers. And you'll notice how they will portray it. They'll always portray it one way. So Revolution Media will always portray it as cops bad, people good. And then the Occupy groups will always portray it that way. And then you'll have all the Tea Party groups, which is always for the cops,
yeah,
right, or so-called Tea Party groups or whatever. And what that tells you is that you just got this easy dialectic here, and then you can look at somebody like Soros putting $33 million into Occupy and into the Ferguson Boston stuff, and it starts to become transparent when you think about it that way.
He's also pouring money into Ukraine.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so we're not exempt.
It brags about it openly on TV.
Yeah. Not to mention what the National Endowment for Democracy does and USAID and all these intelligence fronts. And I think it was the founder, or who was it? I forget who it was. It was NED, National Endowment for Democracy, said we're now doing what the CIA used to do.
Yep, and the guy who founded Doctors Without Borders is Bilderberg. Yeah.
Yeah, and so. And that's another thing. They use these groups to go in there, and they can get in there and operate, just like was it supposedly, there was an intel operation using a vaccination program in Pakistan? Was it Pakistan or Afghanistan? And then it was attacked because it was known as being used as a intelligence operation, so it became a legitimate target from the standpoint of the, Well,
That
don't.
reminds me. There was this girl from Vanderbilt that I was talking to a little bit, maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, and she was talking about, I'm working with doctors, doctors. I always call it doctors without borders. And I said, oh, where are you going? She's like, I'm going to Argentina or somewhere. And I had just been reading about the so-called revolution or whatever was going on there with it. I was like, oh, so I said something like, CIA wanted to put in somebody new. She was like, what? What are you talking about? So I don't really think Doctors Without Borders is what it's supposed to be. She's like, oh, well, I'm going there to just help people. And well, you may be. I said, but I'm guessing that there's probably a revolution going on there. And she's like, yeah. She's like, how'd you know that?
I'm going there to solve the problems of destabilization. No, actually,
Yeah, right.
So, but yes,
I don't think she was an opera. She didn't know anything.
well,
But,
most of them aren't.
right. But what I'm saying is that she's working with all these people who are doing all this stuff.
Yeah. I think most people probably work at NED or USA 8 or just punching their clock and
We're here to help
time.
people. Yeah.
Here to help people. Yeah, they're not. So again, that's and so it's all compartmentalized. That's all. That goes back to that whole Masonic design, right? Rings within rings, and most people who are at the CFR aren't active in this stuff.
You don't have security clearance for this information, Tim.
But I was reading Hidden History by Jeffries. Is his name? What's his name here?
Grant Jeffries.
Yeah.
I'm joking.
Donald Jeffries, Hidden History. It's kind of a book. He basically goes to all these various incidents throughout history, and it's kind of like not about one thing. It's about JFK assassination, 9/11, Marilyn Monroe. Well, and his topic is the CFR, and we're talking. Basically, when I says, how does this serve the interests of the New World Order? All this stuff. I think I can anticipate how you're going to answer that. But here's this thing on the CFR. He goes, let me read this to you. The Council on Foreign Relations is like an establishment country club, a veritable who's who of American policymaking. The mainstream press has historically given scant coverage to exactly what it is that the CFR does. The foreign relations part of the name would seem to indicate a group devoted to the study of foreign policy objectives. Indeed, on rare occasions that the CFR is mentioned in the mainstream media, it is inevitably referred to as an influential foreign policy think tank. Makes it even more curious that so many celebrated figures decidedly lacking in foreign policy experience or have been members. Presently, Warren Beatty, David Geffen, Jimmy Iovine, Tom Brokaw, George Clooney, Katie Couric, Joan Didion, Barry Diller, Jeffrey Katzenberg,
Angelina Jolie.
Yeah, it's the next one. Angelina Jolie, Dan Rather, Paul Tagliabue, NFL, huh? Barbara Walters are all members of the CFR. Obviously, mainstream journalists like Brokaw, Couric, Rather, and Walters should have no role to play in deciding foreign policy. Diller is a media executive, and what does he have to do with any foreign relations? Didion is a novelist. Geffen and Iovine are music industry powers. What possible foreign policy experience do they have? The presence of actors such as Beatty, Clooney, and Jolie, and movie industry powers like Katzenberg and Spielberg on their membership rolls should detract from the credibility of the CFR, as should the membership of Tagliabue, former commissioner of the NFL. It's also full of Rockefellers and elite people like Jesse Jackson.
Yeah, I met Joe Klein.
Yeah,
at the Rand Paul thing, who's a CFR, and I had a conversation with him about this, and I said, what is it? I was a little bit tongue in cheek. I said, what does it take to write at Time Magazine, Mr. Klein? And he said, well, you can't be one of these radicals like Rand Paul. You got to be more mainstream. I'm sitting there thinking, Rand Paul's not that radical, but
Rand Paul's radical. Wow.
He's yeah, you got to be more like I don't know, Mitt Romney. I guess I was like, well, yeah. But not that I wasn't seriously entertaining writing at Time Magazine.
Yeah.
But it was just a conversation because he was at that big Rand Paul dust up back in 2010 or 12 or whenever it was, 10 I think. But yeah, and then so I followed Max Boot for a long time and on Facebook and watched what he posts, and what you start noticing is that a lot of the CFR has to do with media.
Yeah.
And so its main focus is getting the media in line for the domestic and foreign policy.
But that gets into your forte, which is Hollywood movies and all these guys, because it shows sort of the full spectrum dominance.
That's a great point. Yeah, it shows that the people who work in Hollywood are tied into the people who work in the mass media. Absolutely.
There's coordination. There's conspiracy. Yeah. So it's being all controlled, and that's the whole point. That's the same thing with the Trilaterals Commission, the Bilderberg, and all that. And of course, people who belong to Trilaterals Commission and CFR also make their way to Bilderberg. At least a few of them, the important ones do.
Yeah, and remember, this is funny. I was watching some guy's video. Chris, what's his name, that does AMTV? He had a good video. It was an old one, but I missed it, where he was talking about. I remember when Clooney was married to this. The one time he got married, I guess they're already divorced. What's her name? Alamuddin, this kind of hot Egyptian chick or whatever she is.
Oh yeah, yeah.
The lawyer. What? She was a lawyer for?
Yeah.
Assange. She represented Assange. So yeah, the coordination can be quite extensive. And but he was making the point that in that video that Clooney was quite obviously coordinating the fiasco baloney with the interview, the Seth Rogen.
Oh yeah, that's
James
right.
Franco movie.
That's right.
And so the guy who was kind of the point man between the big scale organizations would be Clooney, because he's the one who immediately stepped up as the face of all of this. Of Hollywood needs to rally behind the interview, and right. So he would be a good connect there between the establishment and the mainstream left.
And didn't Tom Secker point out that the either CEO or president of Sony Pictures was also on the board of the Rand Corporation?
Yeah, it's a Rand Corporation thing, right?
Yeah. So it's all being coordinated, and Rand intersects with Tavistock and.
Absolutely, yeah. Alex Abea's book's really good. And Alex Abea's book, he's supposedly he went in there and just said, "Hey, let me write my book about you guys," and they're like, "We're not sure we want to do that, but okay." And so it's approved. Rand Corporation book, and it basically tells everything.
Yeah, and that it gets into like they were at Laurel Canyon, and it gets into
it's Soldiers of Reason, and he talks about Gulf War being prepackaged.
Mm-hmm.
The both of them kind of designed and drawn up like you would draw up a movie script.
Mm-hmm. Which is why I think maybe people like Spielberg and Jeffrey Katzenberg and sharing their ideas. Mm-hmm. But it just showed that the development of foreign policy or policy in general is because they have to control everything. And of course, this gets in your article that I ran across. It's about 4 years old. Tragedy, Hope, and Economics. January 25th, 2012 is the date, but it's still relevant. Very relevant. And you get into this idea. Well, basically, it's Quigley. You entered the article. I think you entered how you had a debate with you had a debate with a professor who denied the existence of globalist, I guess.
Anything like this. Well, he was actually, this guy's a longtime member of the Green Party. And a London-trained lawyer and world expert on the Luddites.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, and so me and this guy, we immediately did not get along, and but I wonder, this guy had to have, he knows a little more than he was letting on.
Yeah.
But he was sort of goading me on, I think, and intentionally trying to insult me in front of the class, which that's kind of what pushed my buttons and led me to getting into a big argument with him about whether these things exist. And I'm like, well, I've got this book with me right here in my hand.
It's a 1,000-page book.
And I started reading quotes from it, and that made him really mad. And so he said, looks like we've got a Glenn Beck follower in the class. And I'm like, Glenn Beck's a complete phony.
Like, Glenn Beck follower.
He's like, we got a radical. Oh, you're a radical. And I kept reading quotes, and he said, well, you can get out of here. So step out, get out of the classroom. Well, I said gladly. And, I wrote that essay right after this happened. I was pretty mad, but I gave most of the professors at Murray State quite a bit of hell. But
well, you read that key quote, of course, which on page 950.
Yeah.
There does exist and has existed for a generation an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the Communist Act.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, this network is which we may identify as the Round Table Group, has no aversion to cooperating with communists of any other groups, and frequently does so. Blah blah blah. So, and then of
And who
course,
formed the roundtable groups and the Royal Institute for International Affairs?
yeah,
Who,
and this
who
is
formed it? The Royal Society.
the Royal Society, and this is Carol Quigley. Again, this is Georgetown professor, advisor to the U.S. military, U.S. State Department, and referenced by Bill Clinton in his acceptance speech at the Democratic. So he's mainstream, and it's if you don't know who Carol Quigley is and his importance, then you really don't know what's really going on in the world. And if you deny his existence, his importance, then you are either ignorant or you are misrepresenting yourself and misleading your students. So
Yeah, this guy was a complete scumbag, and if
Yeah.
I saw him today, I would still punch him. But
this is
if you punch this guy, if you hold him up and shake him, then a bunch of brownies and granola bars will probably. But sometimes those guys are actually the most dangerous because they might be the ones that are the CIA. But
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important too, and I don't want to get off topic, but I always like to point this out because a lot of skeptics give me a hard time over this stuff. But so what we're talking about here is the apex of foreign policy and government and strategy. But the Royal Society and its network also sits at the apex of another important aspect of the modern world, and that's science. And they, I believe, have a huge role in dictating what science is and what it promulgates throughout the university system throughout the West and probably globally because it's just seen as the apex of science, right?
Yeah.
So, but yes, for the foreign policy, it's no different. And I remember hearing this a long time ago from, you just kind of come across this stuff when you're 18 or 19 in conspiracy books, and you hear about the Royal Society and this and that, and you kind of put it on the back burner. And then as you get older and you delve into these big tomes and these big books, the history of the Rockefellers and Cecil Rhodes and these different people and these families, and you start seeing that it's just very real. It's very tangible. They have buildings for the Pratt House and Chatham House.
Yeah. Entire universities, by the way.
Entire universities, oldest university in England, Oxford, right?
Well, look at sociology. Sociology emerged from the University of Chicago.
University of Chicago.
Yeah.
And we even learned that in my sociology classes at university. We talked about that openly, where the history of sociology is the University of Chicago, blah, blah, blah. And, it takes money to start those things. And money comes from the money power. And that's how the money power, you look at, say, if you go to the Rockefeller Foundation website and you look up what they donate to, you'll find hundreds of institutions, many of them religious, by the way.
Yep.
And this is how they control, I know for a fact, the history of Protestantism in America. That's how they bought off all the Protestant universities and how many of them went at seminaries, how many of them, if you start to wonder, why from 1900 to 1960 did almost every major Protestant denomination in the U.S. deny its fundamental doctrines. And I'm talking about the ones that most Christians, even Catholics, would agree on, like, the divinity of Christ or the inspiration of Scripture, these kinds of things, the Trinity. How is it that from 1900 to 1960, almost every major Protestant denomination, the ELCA, that's the liberal Lutherans, the non-Missouri Synod, the PCUSA, Presbyterian Church, United States of America, which led to the creation of the OPC with J. Gresham Machen. Well, how did all this happen? Well, you read these guys like Machen, and he talks about why we needed to form the OPC, Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and he says, well, because of this seminary, and this seminary. Okay, well, what was going on at those seminaries? Oh, well, this is the seminaries where Harry Fosdick is. Who's Harry Fosdick? Well, he's a Rockefeller minister at Riverside Cathedral Church, which is the Rockefeller Church, right? Harry Emerson Fosdick, whatever. And then you find out that, Dulles was Presbyterian, and they're all part of that. And then you realize that same thing happened with Anglicans. And then all these CIA people come out of the Episcopal Church in the U.S. That's all, West Coast Episcopal CIA stuff. It's the exact same networks, is what I'm trying to say. And it's the Rockefellers who not only created the ecumenical movement with their money, Well, they funded it. I guess you could say it was already kind of going on in the late 1800s. But yeah, that's how they bought off all these seminaries, is through the funding. So you say some seminary out podunk wherever, and some guy comes and says, "Hey, yeah, I will donate the $20 million to your seminary. Please install Dr. Barton Liberal as the professor of theological studies."
Yeah,
Oh yeah, we'll take him for $20 million.
yeah, yeah. And that's the same thing they did with Rockefeller took over Notre Dame
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
with Ted Hesburgh, where
Okay.
he was actually chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation, a Catholic bishop,
Oh,
and
well,
he's
that explains why Notre Dame teaches abortion and
yes.
all this stuff now. Okay.
There was like Michael Jones when he was St. Mary's College. He says, I was fired for my position on abortion. And the guy says, well, that's understandable. It's a Catholic organization. No, it's pro-life. He goes, oh.
Exactly. Yeah.
But
Well,
he gets,
the bishop of Memphis, his coat of arms is a communist flag.
yeah, wow.
And I've gone to the Bishop of Memphis's house. I never went inside, but he's got this big, huge house.
Mm-hmm.
Sitting there thinking, well, that's not very communist, but
Yeah, yeah, no, yeah. Well, that's get infiltration. I've
Mhm.
read a number of things about the infiltration of the Catholic Church by you want to call it the Masonic orders or even the Rockefellers. How Time Life had a whole operation directed at it's just John Curtin and Murray and Americanism, using Americanism to infiltrate and take over the Catholic Church, the
Yes.
American Catholic Church,
Yeah.
utilize the church. That's happened. I think they've gone a long way already.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
absolutely true. All that stuff's true. And
yeah,
yeah, most of read a good bit on that back in my 20s, and saw it all firsthand. I was living this stuff out where I was, really interested in. For a time, I wanted to be a monastic. I wanted to enter the priesthood. And then I'm sitting there, I'm like, I don't want to be in the priesthood with a bunch of gay guys and communists.
yeah.
Like, that's not what I signed up for.
That was done intentionally. And I think
I
I
know
read
it
I read
was.
an article. You referenced the book, which I was able to find PDF. What is it? I just put it on my Nook here about infiltration. A woman wrote a book, but about how the church was infiltrated.
AA 1025, that old thing about the communists.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, although I'm skeptical of who she is or what she. I mean, I'm not at all pro-communist or anything like that, but I don't. The problem with that little book is that it's just her her personal testimony of her role as an agent.
Mm-hmm.
So who knows how
Yeah.
extensive, but regardless of how truthful her claim is, that's obviously what happened in the Catholic Church. And so I had a lot of friends that were seminarians and were going into priesthood and things like that, and they would talk about how awful it was at different
Yeah.
seminaries, particularly the ones where they would install, all these pro-gay guys to run the seminaries, and then they would actually screen out candidates who had, quote, radical views, which they meant they weren't homosexual.
Yeah.
And then Michael Rowe's book details that with Goodbye Good Men, and then that's absolutely all completely a plan and a strategy.
I mean, you would think that's an intel operation.
I wonder if the way that the Western intelligence establishment didn't co-opt the Vatican into doing what they wanted, if it wasn't done that way. Sure.
Because another strategy what they employed in the 60s, and this particular incident out in California with the Immaculate Heart of Mary order, and they brought in this self-actualization therapy to help the nuns, and ended up destroying the Holy Order. And what happened was the Holy Orders, the nuns, the priests, this was the backbone of the Catholic school system in California.
Mm-hmm.
It's how it was economically viable. And if you look at Catholic schools now, there are very few nuns. And when I went to Catholic school when I was a kid in the 70s, it was changing then, but half the teachers were still nuns and nuns and priests.
Yes, if you read Michael Davies' trilogy, which is pretty good, it's it's several years old now, but his trilogy on the effects of Vatican II and the liturgy, it's very insightful into the collapse of religious enrollments, as well as seminaries, convents, even baptisms and conversions. Post Vatican II is all, I think, very telling. And Davies even talks about, to a degree, the communist infiltration and things like that.
And Chris, there are some people think Vatican II itself was an operation. That's John Courtney Murray went over there and tried to push. Even I think it was which Rockefeller was. They actually met with the Pope and tried to get him to embrace birth control.
I could talk your ear off about that.
It's probably a whole other topic, but another show. But
but Vatican II is important for all this because you're right. Vatican II, whatever view one takes of it, at least the pragmatic effects of it, fit perfectly into the strategy of what the oligarchs wanted in terms of that billion block of people.
Yeah.
And so how would you do that? Well, the one way that you might do that is, have John the 23rd call an ecumenical council and institute all these so-called reforms that are geared towards, what a lot of Catholics would have a hard time accepting, that you might have cardinals and bishops who would be interested in destroying the church. But that's precisely what you look at these things like the Alta Vendita, or if all you have to do is look at the long history of encyclicals that the popes from Clement the 17th or whoever in the 1700s about Freemasonry and what they said the whole time. You have 13 encyclicals from the 1700s on up to Gregory the 17th, and then I think Leo the 13th was the last one to write specifically on that in Humanum Janus. And then you find out that the goal has always been to take. After they realized they probably couldn't take the papal throne, what they would do is co-opt it. So view that however you might, but there's just no question from personal experience of like I said, friends that did go into the priesthood and talked about how difficult it was being heterosexual, struggling to being screened out because they weren't homosexual.
Yeah.
And what they would do is they would classify that as, what do they call it? Overly rigid or something, some weird thing where it's like if you weren't okay with homosexuality, you were overly rigid. But this was just a mechanism to screen out guys. And if you spend any time with any traditional group, be it Fraternal Society of St. Peter or Society of St. Pius X, any of those groups, those are mostly people who, tried the main route of going into the priesthood and ended up having to go to something like that in order to practice, what they believed, because they were screened out of the mainline system.
Yeah. And this is coupled with we mentioned earlier regarding the attempt to break up the urban Catholic neighborhoods, where the parish is the center of life at these places. And when we talk about whether it's the agenda of Americanism, John Courtney Murray and Time Life Empire and CIA targeting the Catholic Church, or this issue of these urban neighborhoods being broken up to create the diaspora and the suburbia, and then make people lose their Catholic identity and change the nation, homogenize the nation. You don't have to be Catholic to appreciate this. I mean, my point is everyone has a stake in this, because what they're doing is they're breaking apart these independent power sources of independence.
Yes, exactly.
Because they did
it with the Protestants.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's when you're hearing, I'm not Catholic, I don't care about this, I don't like the Catholic. No, it's not. I'm not. Purpose isn't to create an apologia for Catholicism. The point is the Catholic Church represented a speed bump.
Because it doesn't teach depopulation. And let's look at Bolshevism in Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church. Exact same thing. Although in America it may not be Bolsheviks running down your street chopping your head off. It's covert Bolshevism through mass media.
Well, it's cultural Marxism in the West.
Exactly. That's covert, quite directly covert Marxism. But the exact same thing happened in the history of Russia when the Bolsheviks took over, and then they decided, well, we can't just murder the whole Russian Orthodox population. We'll just put KGB bishops in place.
Mm-hmm. And this also creates, again, with the Catholic Church, and a lot of people think of the Catholic Church as being run out of Rome, but it's really very decentralized. It's the parish that matters. So you can target the parish and just really weaken the church, is what they did in the United States.
Well, if it was all run out of Rome, it would. I mean, technically it is, but the problem is that you have, especially in America, the American bishops don't care at all what Rome has said for the last 50 years, and they just do whatever they want anyway.
Good example.
So Rome will issue some statement. This happens all the time. Like there'll be an International Commission on the Liturgy, and they'll say, "Please stop doing this in the liturgy, having the dancers," and then the American bishops they don't give two flying flips about what some document from Rome says about what you're supposed to do.
Mm-hmm. But again, we're getting into we're getting near the end of the interview, so I don't want to open up another can of worms. Again, this gets into the issue of globalism, which is your article about tragedy and hope in economics, or tragedy and hope economics was the title of it.
It is.
Yeah, there we go. A computer screensaver went on. But
well, can I go ahead? I'm sorry.
Oh, go. Just go ahead. Go ahead and exclamate on it.
It boils down to this: page 324. The powers of financial capitalism had a far-reaching plan, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of any country and the economy of the world as a whole. Mm-hmm. Their secret is that they have annexed from government, monarchies, and republics the power to create the world's money. That's the crux of it all. So when you think, oh, there's all these independent actors, where does Islam get its money? Mm-hmm. Now, Dreyfus's book, Devil's Game, has a great chapter on Islamic banking. And yes, there are wealthy Saudi, radical Wahhabist people out there. But the problem is that their money is tied up in the exact same money system that I just quoted you. So that's what I'm saying, is that there's not all these independent actors because the monetary system is not independent.
Yep. Do you remember that scene in Network with Warren Beatty?
Mm-hmm. That's a great one, yeah.
The Saudis have taken billions of dollars out of this country. By golly, they're going to put it back. And he goes, you're going to tell the country this. Why me? Because you're on TV, you idiot.
Right. And Quigley explicitly says, too, how it started through fraudulent gold certificates, mm-hmm. right? Through creating gold notes, and then you could fractionally reserve, or you could institute borrowing based on fractional reserve lending, where you printed more gold notes than you had gold.
Yep, and you just perpetual debt. Right. And of course, that's the source of today's. That's the source of the housing bubble, which I think was a big pump and dump scheme to steal more. The student debt crisis, right? Mm-hmm. You don't get that unless you have endless credit, right?
Right, and Quigley explicitly links it to the Bank of England and the charters of the Bank of England, the gold notes. In other words, this is where it started happening, and who was running the Bank of England for all this? Well, it was the Rothschild men.
Yeah. So and through debt, through issuance of fiat debt-based money, you can literally loan money that didn't exist prior to the loan.
And now that we have international electronic banking, the flash trades and the wash trades and all that, J.P. Morgan and these big companies can scam into infinity.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Mm-hmm. It really is. Well, listen, Jay, I had a good bit of the evening tonight. It was great. Okay. Anything else you want to say? You want to conclude here, or did we miss anything?
Just to remind people that Jay's analysis is supported through the people who subscribe to it. And so if you've learned a lot, we think about paying for Christmas gifts. We think about paying for products. But everybody seems to assume that if it's knowledge or education, you deserve it free, which is fine to a degree, but I put a lot of work and time into it. So if anybody feels so inclined, please do subscribe to help me keep going.
Yeah. So, I mean, education, obviously if education were generally a free market in this country and people had operated on an honest basis, it would be a lot cheaper, but it still wouldn't be free.
Right. You would have genuine competition, and it wouldn't be a system set up where the state says that you have to go to a state university to get the state issued piece of paper that says that the state allows you to work. You could
Like
just
you said,
you could learn on your own and show that I actually better than the state.
that's right. Well, listen, Jay, thanks a lot.
All right.
And it's jaysanalysis.com. You can also catch a show, Esoteric Hollywood. Is that 2 or 3 times a week?
4.
4? Wow. You do 4 separate shows a week?
Yeah, it's a lot of work. Tuesday to Friday night, 10 p.m. on talknetwork.com.
Well, then I really appreciate you coming on my show tonight. Wow, thanks.
Mm-hmm, sure.
Thanks. Wow, that's okay. Wow, okay. And your book is coming out next year?
Should be out in the spring, yeah.
Okay, well, and
it will conveniently be titled Esoteric Hollywood.
Esoteric Hollywood. Okay, great. Okay, listen, well, thanks, Jay, and we'll talk again soon, and good night.
All right, have a good night. Thanks, Tim.
Take it easy. Bye.